Listen and relax. Crafting serenity, one audiobook at a time.
You liked Mrs. Crale? I was very fond of Mrs. Crale. The efficient voice softened, held warmth and feeling. Very fond of her, and very sorry for her. And your pupil, Angela Warren. She was a most interesting girl. One of the most interesting pupils I have had. A really good brain. Undisciplined, quick-tempered, most difficult to manage in many ways, but really a very fine character. She paused and then went on. I always hoped that she would accomplish something worthwhile, and she has. You have read her book on the Sahara? And she excavated those very interesting tombs in the Fayum. Yes, I am proud of Angela. I was not at Alderbury very long, 2 years and a half, but I always cherished the belief that I helped to stimulate her mind and encourage her taste for archaeology. Poirot murmured, I understand that it was decided to continue her education by sending her to school. You must have resented that decision. Not at all, Monsieur Poirot. I thoroughly concurred with it. She paused and went on. Let me make the matter clear to you. Angela was a dear girl, really a very dear girl, warm-hearted and impulsive. But she was also what I call a difficult girl. That is, she was at a difficult age. There is always a moment where a girl feels unsure of herself, neither child nor woman. At 1 minute, Angela would be sensible and mature, quite grown up, in fact. But a minute later, she would relapse into being a hoydenish child, playing mischievous tricks and being rude and losing her temper. Girls, you know, feel difficult at that age. They're terribly sensitive. Everything that is said to them they resent. They are annoyed at being treated like a child. Then they suddenly feel shy at being treated like adults. Angela was in that state. She had fits of temper, would suddenly resent teasing and flare out. Then she would be sulky for days at a time, sitting about and frowning. Then again she would be in wild spirits, climbing trees, rushing about with the garden boys, refusing to submit to any kind of authority. Miss Williams paused and went on. When a girl gets to that stage, school is very helpful. She needs the stimulation of other minds. That, and the wholesome discipline of a community, help her to become a reasonable member of society. Angela's home conditions were not what I would have called ideal. Mrs. Crale spoiled her, for one thing. Angela had only to appeal to her, and Mrs. Crale always backed her up. The result was that Angela considered she had first claim upon her sister's time and attention, and it was in these moods of hers that she used to clash with Mr. Crale. Mr. Crale naturally thought that he should come first, and intended to do so. He was really very fond of the girl. They were good companions and used to spar together quite amiably, but there were times when Mr. Crale used suddenly to resent Mrs. Crale's preoccupation with Angela. Like all men, he was a spoiled child. He expected everybody to make a fuss of him. Then he and Angela used to have a real set to, and very often Mrs. Crale would take Angela's side. Then he would be furious. On the other hand, if she supported him, Angela would be furious. It was on these occasions that Angela used to revert to childish ways and play some spiteful trick on him. He had a habit of tossing off his drinks, and she once put a lot of salt into his drink. The whole thing, of course, acted as an emetic, and he was inarticulate with fury. But what really brought things to a head was when she put a lot of slugs into his bed. He had a queer aversion for slugs. He lost his temper completely and said that the girl had got to be sent away to school. He wasn't going to put up with all this petty nonsense anymore. Angela was terribly upset, though actually she had once or twice expressed a wish herself to go to a boarding school, but she chose to make a huge grievance of it. Mrs. Crale didn't want her to go, but allowed herself to be persuaded, largely owing, I think, to what I said to her on the subject. I pointed out that it would be greatly to Angela's advantage, and that I thought it would be really a great benefit to the girl. So it was settled that she should go to Helston, a very fine school on the south coast, in the autumn term. But Mrs. Crale was still unhappy about it all those holidays, and Angela kept up a grudge against Mr. Crale whenever she remembered. It wasn't really serious, you understand, Monsieur Poirot, but it made a kind of undercurrent that summer to, well, to everything else that was going on. Poirot said, meaning Elsa Greer? Miss Williams said sharply, exactly, and shut her lips very tight after the word. What was your opinion of Elsa Greer? I had no opinion of her at all. A thoroughly unprincipled young woman. She was very young, old enough to know better. I can see no excuse for her. None at all. She fell in love with him, I suppose. Miss Williams interrupted with a snort. Fell in love with him, indeed? I should hope, Monsieur Poirot, that whatever our feelings, we can keep them in decent control, and we can certainly control our actions. That girl had absolutely no morals of any kind. It meant nothing to her that Mr. Crail was a married man. She was absolutely shameless about it all, cool and determined. Possibly she may have been badly brought up, but that's the only excuse I can find for her. Mr. Crail's death must have been a terrible shock to her. Oh, it was. And she herself was entirely to blame for it. I don't go as far as condoning murder, but all the same, Monsieur Poirot, if ever a woman was driven to breaking point, that woman was Caroline Crail. I tell you frankly, there were moments when I would have liked to murder them both myself. Flaunting the girl in his wife's face. Listening to her, having to put up with the girl's insolence, and she was insolent, Monsieur Poirot. Oh, no. Amias Crail deserved what he got. No man should treat his wife as he did and not be punished for it. His death was a just retribution. Hercule Poirot said, "You feel strongly." The small woman looked at him with those indomitable grey eyes. She said, "I feel very strongly about the marriage tie. Unless it is respected and upheld, a country degenerates." Mrs. Crail was a devoted and faithful wife. Her husband deliberately flouted her and introduced his mistress into her home. As I say, he deserved what he got. He goaded her past endurance, and I, for one, do not blame her for what she did. Poirot said slowly, "He acted very badly, that I admit, but he was a great artist, remember." Miss Williams gave a terrific snort. "Oh, yes, I know. That's always the excuse nowadays, an artist. An excuse for every kind of loose living, for drunkenness, for brawling, for infidelity. And what kind of an artist was Mr. Crail when all is said and done? It may be the fashion to admire his pictures for a few years, but they won't last. Why, he couldn't even draw. His perspective was terrible. Even his anatomy was quite incorrect. I know something of what I am talking about, Monsieur Poirot. I studied painting for a time as a girl in Florence. And to anyone who knows and appreciates the great masters, these daubs of Mr. Crail's are really ludicrous. Just splashing a few colours about on the canvas, no construction, no careful drawing. No." She shook her head. "Don't ask me to admire Mr. Crail's painting." "Two of them are in the Tate Gallery," Poirot reminded her. Miss Williams sniffed. "Possibly. So is one of Mr. Epstein's statues, I believe." Poirot perceived that, according to Miss Williams, the last word had been said. He abandoned the subject of art. He said, "You were with Mrs. Crail when she found the body?" "Yes. She and I went down from the house together after lunch. Angela had left her pullover on the beach after bathing, or else in the boat. She was always very careless about her things. I parted from Mrs. Crail at the door of the Battery garden, but she called me back almost at once. I believe Mr. Crail had been dead over an hour. He was sprawled on the bench near his easel." "Was she terribly upset at the discovery?" "What exactly do you mean by that, Monsieur Poirot?" "I am asking you what your impressions were at the time." "Oh, I see. Well, yes, she seemed to me quite dazed. She sent me off to telephone for the doctor. After all, we couldn't be absolutely sure he was dead. It might have been a cataleptic seizure." "Did she suggest such a possibility?" "I don't remember." "And you went and telephoned?" Miss Williams' tone was dry and brusque. "I had gone half up the path when I met Mr. Meredith Blake. I entrusted my errand to him and returned to Mrs. Crail. I thought, you see, she might have collapsed, and men are no good in a matter of that kind." "And had she collapsed?" Miss Williams said dryly, "Mrs. Crail was quite in command of herself. She was quite different from Miss Greer, who made a hysterical and very unpleasant scene." "What kind of a scene?" "She tried to attack Mrs. Crail." "You mean she realized that Mrs. Crail was responsible for Mr. Crail's death?" Miss Williams considered for a moment or two. "No, she could hardly be sure of that. That terrible suspicion had not yet arisen. Miss Greer just screamed out, 'It's all your doing, Caroline. You killed him. It's all your fault.' She did not actually say, 'You've poisoned him,' but I think there is no doubt that she thought so." "And Mrs. Crail?" Miss Williams moved restlessly. "Must we be hypocritical, Monsieur Poirot? I cannot tell you what Mrs. Crail really felt or thought at that moment. Whether it was horror at what she had done. Did it seem like that?" No, I can't say it did. Stunned, yes, and I think frightened. Yes, I'm sure frightened. But that is natural enough. Hercule Poirot said in a dissatisfied tone, Yes, perhaps that is natural enough. What view did she adopt officially as to her husband's death? Suicide. She said very definitely from the first that it must be suicide. Did she say the same when she was talking to you privately, or did she put forward any other theory? No, she took pains to impress upon me that it must be suicide. Miss Williams sounded embarrassed. And what did you say to that? Really, Monsieur Poirot, does it matter what I said? Yes, I think it does. Well, I don't see why. But as though his expectant silence hypnotized her, she said reluctantly, I think I said, certainly, Mrs. Crail, it must have been suicide. Did you believe your own words? Miss Williams raised her head. She said firmly, No, I did not. But please understand, Monsieur Poirot, that I was entirely on Mrs. Crail's side. If you like to put it that way, my sympathies were with her, not with the police. You would have liked to have seen her acquitted. Miss Williams said defiantly, Yes, I would. Poirot said, Then you are in sympathy with her daughter's feelings. I have every sympathy with Carla. Would you have any objection to writing out for me a detailed account of the tragedy? You mean for her to read? Yes. Miss Williams said slowly, No, I have no objection. She is quite determined to go into the matter, is she? Yes. I dare say it would have been preferable if the truth had been kept from her. Miss Williams interrupted him. No. It is always better to face the truth. It's no use evading unhappiness by tampering with facts. Carla has had a shock learning the truth. Now she wants to know exactly how the tragedy came about. That seems to me the right attitude for a brave young woman to take. Once she knows all about it, she will be able to forget it again, and go on with the business of living her own life. Perhaps you are right, said Poirot. I'm quite sure I'm right. But you see, there is more to it than that. She not only wants to know, she wants to prove her mother innocent. Miss Williams said, Poor child. That is what you say, is it? Miss Williams said, I see now why you said it might be better if she had never known. All the same, I think it is best as it is. To wish to find her mother innocent is a natural hope. And hard though the actual revelation may be, I think from what you say of her that Carla is brave enough to learn the truth and not flinch from it. You are sure it is the truth? I don't understand you. You see no loophole for believing that Mrs. Crail was innocent. I don't think that possibility has ever been seriously considered. And yet she herself clung to the theory of suicide. Miss Williams said dryly, The poor woman had to say something. Do you know that when Mrs. Crail was dying she left a letter for her daughter, in which she solemnly swears that she is innocent? Miss Williams stared. Well, that was very wrong of her, she said sharply. You think so? Yes, I do. Oh, I dare say you are a sentimentalist like most men, Poirot interrupted indignantly. I am not a sentimentalist, but there is such a thing as false sentiment. Why write that? A lie? At such a solemn moment? To spare your child pain? Yes, many women would do that. But I should not have thought it of Mrs. Crail. She was a brave woman and a truthful woman. I should have thought it far more like her to have told her daughter not to judge. Poirot said with slight exasperation, You will not even consider, then, the possibility that what Caroline Crail wrote was the truth? Certainly not. And yet, you profess to have loved her. I did love her. I had a great affection and a deep sympathy for her. Well, then, Miss Williams looked at him in a very odd way. You don't understand, Monsieur Poirot. It doesn't matter my saying this now, so long afterwards. You see, I happen to know that Caroline Crail was guilty. What? It's true. Whether I did right in withholding what I knew at the time, I cannot be sure. But I did withhold it. But you must take it from me, quite definitely, that I know Caroline Crail was guilty. This little pig cried wee, wee, wee. Angela Warren's flat overlooked Regent's Park. Here, on this spring day, a soft air wafted in through the open window, and one might have had the illusion that one was in the country if it had not been for the steady, menacing roar of the traffic passing below. Poirot turned from the window as the door opened, and Angela Warren came into the room. It was not the first time he had seen her. He had availed himself of the opportunity to attend a lecture she had given at the Royal Geographical. It had been, he considered, an excellent lecture. Dry, perhaps, from the view of popular appeal. Miss Warren had an excellent delivery. She neither paused nor hesitated for a word. She did not repeat herself. The tones of her voice were clear and not unmelodious. She made no concessions to romantic appeal or love of adventure. There was very little human interest in the lecture. It was an admirable recital of concise facts, adequately illustrated by excellent slides and with intelligent deductions from the facts recited. Dry, precise, clear, lucid, highly technical. The soul of Hercule Poirot approved. Here, he considered, was an orderly mind. Now that he saw her at close quarters, he realized that Angela Warren might easily have been a very handsome woman. Her features were regular, though severe. She had finely marked dark brows, clear, intelligent brown eyes, a fine, pale skin. She had very square shoulders and a slightly mannish walk. There was certainly about her no suggestion of the little pig who cries wee wee. But on the right cheek, disfiguring and puckering the skin, was that healed scar. The right eye was slightly distorted, the corner pulled downwards by it, but no one would have realized that the sight of the eye was destroyed. It seemed to Hercule Poirot almost certain that she had lived with her disability so long that she was now completely unconscious of it. And it occurred to him that of the 5 people in whom he had become interested as a result of his investigations, those who might have been said to start with the fullest advantages were not those who had actually wrested the most success and happiness from life. Elsa, who might have been said to start with all the advantages, youth, beauty, riches, had done worst. She was like a flower overtaken by untimely frost, still in bud, but without life. Cecilia Williams, to outward appearances, had no assets of which to boast. Nevertheless, to Poirot's eye, there was no despondency there, and no sense of failure. Miss Williams' life had been interesting to her. She was still interested in people and events. She had that enormous mental and moral advantage of a strict Victorian upbringing denied to us in these days. She had done her duty in that station of life to which it had pleased God to call her, and that assurance encased her in an armor impregnable to the slings and darts of envy, discontent, and regret. She had her memories, her small pleasures, made possible by stringent economies and sufficient health and vigor to enable her still to be interested in life. Now, in Angela Warren, that young creature handicapped by disfigurement and its consequent humiliation, Poirot believed he saw a spirit strengthened by its necessary fight for confidence and assurance. The undisciplined schoolgirl had given place to a vital and forceful woman, a woman of considerable mental power and gifted with abundant energy to accomplish ambitious purposes. She was a woman, Poirot felt sure, both happy and successful. Her life was full and vivid and eminently enjoyable. She was not, incidentally, the type of woman that Poirot really liked. Though admiring the clear-cut precision of her mind, she had just a sufficient nuance of the femme formidable about her to alarm him as a mere man. His taste had always been for the flamboyant and the extravagant. With Angela Warren, it was easy to come to the point of his visit. There was no subterfuge. He merely recounted Carla Lamarchand's interview with him. Angela Warren's severe face lighted up appreciatively. "Little Carla? She's over here? Oh, I would like to see her so much. You have not kept in touch with her?" "Oh, hardly as much as I should have done. I was a schoolgirl at the time she went to Canada, and I realized, of course, that in a year or two she would have forgotten us. Of late years, an occasional present at Christmas has been the only link between us. I imagined that she would by now be completely immersed in the Canadian atmosphere, and that her future would lie over there. Better so in the circumstances. Poirot said, "One might think so, certainly. A change of name, a change of scene, a new life. But it was not to be so easy as that." And he then told of Carla's engagement, the discovery she had made upon coming of age, and her motives in coming to England. Angela Warren listened quietly, her disfigured cheek resting on one hand. She betrayed no emotion during the recital, but as Poirot finished, she said quietly, "Good for Carla." Poirot was startled. It was the first time that he had met with this reaction. He said, "You approve, Miss Warren?" "Well, certainly. I wish her every success. Anything I can do to help, I will. I feel guilty, you know, that I haven't attempted anything myself." "Then you think that there is a possibility that she is right in her views?" Angela Warren said sharply, "Well, of course she's right. Caroline didn't do it. I've always known that." Hercule Poirot murmured, "You surprise me very much indeed, mademoiselle." "Everybody else I have spoken to—" She cut in sharply. "Oh, you mustn't go by that. I've no doubt that the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. My own conviction is based on knowledge of my sister. I just know, quite simply and definitely, that Caro couldn't have killed anyone." "Can one say that with certainty? Of any human creature?" "Probably not in most cases. I agree that the human animal is full of curious surprises, but in Caroline's case there were special reasons. Reasons which I have a better chance of appreciating than anyone else could." She touched her damaged cheek. "You see this? You've probably heard about it." Poirot nodded. "Caroline did that. That's why I'm sure. I know that she didn't do murder." "It would not be a convincing argument to most people." "No, it would be the opposite. It was actually used in that way, I believe, as evidence that Caroline had a violent and ungovernable temper. Because she had injured me as a baby, learned men argued that she would be equally capable of poisoning an unfaithful husband." Poirot said, "I at least appreciated the difference. A sudden fit of ungovernable rage does not lead you to first abstract a poison and then use it deliberately on the following day." Angela Warren waved an impatient hand. "That's not what I mean at all. I must try and make it plain to you. Supposing that you are a person normally affectionate and of kindly disposition, but that you are also liable to intense jealousy, and supposing that during the years of your life when control is most difficult, you do, in a fit of rage, come near to committing what is in effect murder. Think of the awful shock, the horror, the remorse that seizes upon you. To a sensitive person like Caroline, that horror and remorse will never quite leave you. It never left her. I don't suppose I was consciously aware of it at the time, but looking back I recognize it perfectly. Caro was haunted, continually haunted, by the fact that she had injured me. That knowledge never left her in peace. It colored all her actions. It explained her attitude to me. Nothing was too good for me. In her eyes I must always come first. Half the quarrels she had with Amias were on my account. I was inclined to be jealous of him and played all kinds of tricks on him. I pinched cat stuff to put in his drink, and I once put a hedgehog in his bed. But Caroline was always on my side." Miss Warren paused. Then she went on. "It was very bad for me, of course. I got horribly spoilt. But that's neither here nor there. We're discussing the effect on Caroline. The result of that impulse to violence was a lifelong abhorrence of any further act of the same kind. Caro was always watching herself, always in fear that something of that kind might happen again, and she took her own ways of guarding against it. One of these ways was a great extravagance of language. She felt, and I think psychologically quite truly, that if she were violent enough in speech, she would have no temptation to violence in action. She found by experience that the method worked. That's why I've heard Caro say things like, 'I'd like to cut so-and-so in pieces and boil him slowly in oil.' And she'd say to me, or to Amias, 'If you go on annoying me, I shall murder you.' In the same way, she quarreled easily and violently. She recognized, I think, the impulse to violence that there was in her nature, and she deliberately gave it an outlet that way. She and Amias used to have the most fantastic and lurid quarrels." Hercule Poirot nodded. "Yes, there was evidence of that. They quarreled like cat and dog, it was said. Angela Warren said, "Exactly. That's what's so stupid and misleading about evidence. Of course Caro and Amias quarreled. Of course they said bitter and outrageous and cruel things to each other. What nobody appreciates is that they enjoyed quarreling. But they did. Amias enjoyed it too. They were that kind of couple. They both of them liked drama and emotional scenes. Most men don't. They like peace. But Amias was an artist. He liked shouting and threatening and generally being outrageous. It was like letting off steam to him. He was the kind of man who, when he loses his collar stud, bellows the house down. It sounds very odd, I know, but living that way with continual rows and makings up was Amias's and Caroline's idea of fun." She made an impatient gesture. "If they'd only not hustled me away and let me give evidence, I'd have told them that." Then she shrugged her shoulders. "But I don't suppose they would have believed me. And anyway, then it wouldn't have been as clear in my mind as it is now. It was the kind of thing I knew but hadn't thought about, and certainly had never dreamed of putting into words." She looked across at Poirot. "You do see what I mean?" He nodded vigorously. "I see perfectly, and I realize the absolute rightness of what you have said. There are people to whom agreement is monotony. They require the stimulant of dissension to create drama in their lives." "Exactly. May I ask you, Miss Warren, what were your own feelings at the time?" Angela Warren sighed. "Mostly bewilderment and helplessness, I think. It seemed a fantastic nightmare. Caroline was arrested very soon, about 3 days afterwards, I think. I can still remember my indignation, my dumb fury, and of course my childish faith that it was just a silly mistake, that it would be all right. Caro was chiefly perturbed about me. She wanted me kept right away from it all as far as possible. She got Miss Williams to take me away to some relations almost at once. The police had no objection, and then when it was decided that my evidence would not be needed, arrangements were made for me to go to school abroad. I hated going, of course, but it was explained to me that Caro had me terribly on her mind, and that the only way I could help her was by going." She paused. Then she said, "So I went to Munich. I was there when the verdict was given. They never let me go and see Caro. Caro wouldn't have it. That's the only time, I think, when she failed in understanding." "You cannot be sure of that, Miss Warren. To visit someone dearly loved in a prison might make a terrible impression on a young, sensitive girl." "Possibly." Angela Warren got up. She said, "After the verdict, when she had been condemned, my sister wrote me a letter. I have never shown it to anyone. I think I ought to show it to you now. It may help you to understand the kind of person Caroline was. If you like, you may take it to show to Carla also." She went to the door. Then, turning back, she said, "Come with me. There's a portrait of Caroline in my room." For a second time, Poirot stood gazing up at a portrait. As a painting, Caroline Creille's portrait was mediocre, but Poirot looked at it with interest. It was not its artistic value that interested him. He saw a long oval face, a gracious line of jaw, and a sweet, slightly timid expression. It was a face uncertain of itself, emotional, and with a withdrawn, hidden beauty. It lacked the forcefulness and vitality of her daughter's face, that energy and joy of life Carla Le Marchant had doubtless inherited from her father. This was a less positive creature, yet looking at the painted face, Hercule Poirot understood why an imaginative man like Quentin Fogg had not been able to forget her. Angela Warren stood at his side again, a letter in her hand. She said quietly, "Now that you've seen what she was like, read her letter." He unfolded it carefully and read what Caroline Creille had written 16 years ago. "My darling little Angela, you will hear bad news and you will grieve. But what I want to impress upon you is that it is all right. I have never told you lies, and I don't now when I say that I am actually happy, that I feel an essential rightness and a peace that I have never known before. It's all right, darling. It's all right. Don't look back and regret and grieve for me. Go on with your life and succeed. You can, I know. It's all right, darling, and I'm going to Amias. I haven't the least doubt that we shall be together. I couldn't have lived without him. Do this one thing for me. Be happy. I've told you I'm happy. One has to pay one's debts. It's lovely to feel peaceful. Your loving sister, Caro. Hercule Poirot read it through twice. Then he handed it back. He said, "That is a very beautiful letter, mademoiselle, and a very remarkable one. A very remarkable one." Caroline, said Angela Warren, was a very remarkable person. Yes, an unusual mind. You take it that this letter indicates innocence? Well, of course it does. It does not say so explicitly, because Caro would know that I'd never dream of her being guilty. Perhaps. But it might be taken another way, in the sense that she was guilty, and that in expiating her crime, she will find peace. It fitted in, he thought, with the description of her in court. And he experienced in this moment the strongest doubts he had yet felt of the course to which he had committed himself. Everything so far had pointed unswervingly to Caroline Creille's guilt. Now, even her own words testified against her. On the other side was only the unshaken conviction of Angela Warren. Angela had known her well, undoubtedly, but might not her certainty be the fanatical loyalty of an adolescent girl, up in arms for a dearly loved sister? As though she had read his thoughts, Angela Warren said, "No, Monsieur Poirot. I know Caroline wasn't guilty." Poirot said briskly, "The bon Dieu knows I do not want to shake you on that point. But let us be practical. You say your sister was not guilty. Very well then. What really happened?" Angela nodded thoughtfully. She said, "That is difficult, I agree. I suppose that, as Caroline said, Amias committed suicide. Is that likely from what you know of his character?" "Very unlikely. But you do not say, as in the first case, that you know it is impossible." "No, because as I said just now, most people do impossible things. That is to say, things that seem out of character. But I presume, if you know them intimately, it wouldn't be out of character." "You knew your brother-in-law well?" "Yes, but not like I knew Caro. It seems to me quite fantastic that Amias should have killed himself, but I suppose he could have done so. In fact, he must have done so." "You cannot see any other explanation?" Angela accepted the suggestion calmly, but not without a certain stirring of interest. "Oh, I see what you mean. I've never really considered that possibility. You mean one of the other people killed him? That it was a deliberate, cold-blooded murder? It might have been, might it not?" "Yes, it might have been, but it certainly seems very unlikely." "More unlikely than suicide?" "Well, that's difficult to say. On the face of it, there was no reason for suspecting anybody else. There isn't now, when I look back. All the same, let us consider the possibility. Who, of those intimately concerned, would you say was, shall we say, the most likely person?" "Well, let me think. Well, I didn't kill him. And the Elsa creature certainly didn't. She was mad with rage when he died. Who else was there? Meredith Blake. He was always very devoted to Caroline. Quite a tame cat about the house. I suppose that might give him a motive in a way. In a book, he might have wanted to get Amias out of the way so that he himself could marry Caroline. But he could have achieved that just as well by letting Amias go off with Elsa, and then in due time consoling Caroline. Besides, I really can't see Meredith as a murderer. Too mild, and too cautious. Who else was there?" Poirot suggested. "Miss Williams? Philip Blake?" Angela's grave face relaxed into a smile for a minute. "Miss Williams? One can't really make oneself believe that one's governess could commit a murder. Miss Williams was always so unyielding and so full of rectitude." She paused a minute, and then went on. She was devoted to Caroline, of course. Would have done anything for her, and she hated Amias. She was a great feminist and disliked men. Is that enough for murder? Surely not. It would hardly seem so, agreed Poirot. Angela went on. Philip Blake. She was silent for a few moments. Then she said quietly, I think, if we're just talking of likelihoods, he's the most likely person. Poirot said, You interest me very much, Miss Warren. May I ask why you say that? Nothing at all definite. But from what I remember of him, I should say he was a person of rather limited imagination. And a limited imagination predisposes you to murder? It might lead you to take a crude way of settling your difficulties. Men of that type get a certain satisfaction from action of some kind or other. Murder is a very crude business, don't you think, sir? Yes, I think you are right. It is definitely a point of view, that, but all the same, Miss Warren, there must be more to it than that. What motive could Philip Blake possibly have had? Angela Warren did not answer at once. She stood frowning down at the floor. Hercule Poirot said, He was Amias Creel's best friend, was he not? She nodded. But there is something in your mind, Miss Warren, something that you have not yet told me. Were the two men rivals, perhaps, over the girl? Over Elsa? Angela Warren shook her head. Oh, no, not Philip. What is there, then? Angela Warren said slowly, Do you know the way things suddenly come back to you, after years, perhaps? I'll explain what I mean. Somebody told me a story once, when I was 11. I saw no point in that story whatsoever. It didn't worry me, it just passed straight over my head. I don't believe I ever, as they say, thought of it again. But about 2 years ago, sitting in the stalls at a review, that story came back to me. And I was so surprised that I actually said out loud, Oh, now I see the point of that silly story about the rice pudding. And yet, there had been no direct allusion on the same lines. Only some fun sailing rather near the wind. Poirot said, I understand what you mean, mademoiselle. Then you will understand what I'm going to tell you. I was once staying at a hotel. As I walked along a passage, one of the bedroom doors opened, and a woman I knew came out. It was not her bedroom, and she registered the fact plainly on her face when she saw me. And I knew then the meaning of the expression I had once seen on Caroline's face when at Alderbury she came out of Philip Blake's room one night. She leant forward, stopping Poirot's words. I had no idea at the time, you understand. I knew things. Girls of the age I was usually do, but I didn't connect them with reality. Caroline coming out of Philip Blake's bedroom was just Caroline coming out of Philip Blake's bedroom to me. It might have been Miss Williams' room or my room, but what I did notice was the expression on her face. A queer expression that I didn't know and couldn't understand. I didn't understand it until, as I have told you, the night in Paris when I saw that same expression on another woman's face. Poirot said slowly, But what you tell me, Miss Warren, is sufficiently astonishing. From Philip Blake himself I got the impression that he disliked your sister, and always had done so. Angela said, I know. I can't explain it, but there it is. Poirot nodded slowly. Already in his interview with Philip Blake, he had felt vaguely that something did not ring true. That overdone animosity against Caroline, it had not somehow been natural. And the words and phrases from his conversation with Meredith Blake came back to him. Very upset when Amias married, did not go near them for over a year. Had Philip then always been in love with Caroline? And had his love, when she chose Amias, turned to bitterness and hate? Yes. Philip had been too vehement, too biased. Poirot visualized him thoughtfully. The cheerful, prosperous man with his golf and his comfortable house. What had Philip Blake really felt 16 years ago? Angela Warren was speaking. I don't understand, you see. I've no experience in love affairs. They haven't come my way. I've told you this for what it's worth, in case it might have a bearing on what happened. Book 2. Narrative of Philip Blake. Dear Monsieur Poirot, I am fulfilling my promise, and herewith find enclosed an account of the events relating to the death of Amias Creole. After such a lapse of time, I am bound to point out that my memories may not be strictly accurate, but I have put down what occurred to the best of my recollection. Yours truly, Philip Blake. Notes on progress of events leading up to murder of Amias Creole on September 19th. My friendship with deceased dates back to a very early period. His home and mine were next door to each other in the country, and our families were friends. Amias Creole was a little over 2 years older than I was. We played together as boys in the holidays, though we were not at the same school. From the point of view of my long knowledge of the man, I feel myself particularly qualified to testify as to his character and general outlook on life. And I will say this straight away. To anyone who knew Amias Creole well, the notion of his committing suicide is quite ridiculous. Creole would never have taken his own life. He was far too fond of living. The contention of the defense at the trial that Creole was obsessed by conscience and took poison in a fit of remorse is utterly absurd to anyone who knew the man. Creole, I should say, had very little conscience, and certainly not a morbid one. Moreover, he and his wife were on bad terms, and I don't think he would have had any scruples about breaking up what was to him a very unsatisfactory married life. He was prepared to look after her financial welfare and that of the child of the marriage, and I'm sure would have done so generously. He was a very generous man, and altogether a warm-hearted and lovable person. Not only was he a great painter, but he was a man whose friends were devoted to him, and as far as I know, he had no enemies. I had also known Caroline Creole for many years. I knew her before her marriage, when she used to come and stay at Alderbury. She was then a somewhat neurotic girl, subject to uncontrollable outbursts of temper, and not without attraction, but unquestionably a difficult person to live with. She showed her devotion to Amias almost immediately. He, I do not think, was really very much in love with her, but they were frequently thrown together. She was, as I say, attractive, and they eventually became engaged. Amias Creole's best friends were rather apprehensive about the marriage, as they felt that Caroline was quite unsuited to him. This caused a certain amount of strain in the first few years between Creole's wife and Creole's friends, but Amias was a loyal friend and was not disposed to give up his old friends at the bidding of his wife. After a few years, he and I were on the same old terms, and I was a frequent visitor at Alderbury. I may add that I stood godfather to the little girl, Carla. This proves, I think, that Amias considered me his best friend, and it gives me authority to speak for a man who can no longer speak for himself. To come to the actual events of which I have been asked to write, I arrived down at Alderbury, so I see by an old diary, 5 days before the crime, that is on September the 13th. I was conscious at once of a certain tension in the atmosphere. There was also staying in the house Miss Elsa Greer, whom Amias was painting at the time. It was the first time I had seen Miss Greer in the flesh, and I had been aware of her existence for some time. Amias had raved about her to me a month previously. He had met, he said, a marvellous girl. He talked about her so enthusiastically that I said to him jokingly, "Be careful, old boy, or you'll be losing your head again." He told me not to be a bloody fool. He was painting the girl. He'd no personal interest in her. I said, "Tell that to the Marines. I've heard you say that before." He said, "This time it's different," to which I answered somewhat cynically, "It always is." Amias then looked quite worried and anxious. He said, "You don't understand. She's just a girl, not much more than a child." He added that she had very modern views and was absolutely free from old-fashioned prejudices. He said, "She's honest and natural and absolutely fearless." I thought to myself, though I didn't say so, that Amias had certainly got it badly this time. A few weeks later, I heard comments from other people. It was said that the Greer girl was absolutely infatuated. Somebody else said that it was a bit thick of Amias, considering how young the girl was, whereupon somebody else sniggered and said that Elsa Greer knew her way about all right. Further remarks were that the girl was rolling in money and had always got everything she wanted, and also that she was the one who was making most of the running. There was a question as to what Creole's wife thought about it, and the significant reply that she must be used to that sort of thing by now. to which someone demurred by saying they'd heard that she was jealous as hell and led Crail such an impossible life that any man would be justified in having a fling from time to time. I mention all this because I think it's important that the state of affairs before I got down there should be fully realized. I was interested to see the girl. She was remarkably good-looking and very attractive, and I was, I must admit, maliciously amused to note that Caroline was cutting up very rough indeed. Amias Crail himself was less light-hearted than usual, though to anyone who did not know him well, his manner would have appeared much as usual. I, who knew him so intimately, noted at once various signs of strain, uncertain temper, fits of moody abstraction, general irritability of manner. Although he was always inclined to be moody when painting, the picture he was at work upon did not account entirely for the strain he showed. He was pleased to see me, and said as soon as we were alone, "Thank goodness you've turned up, Phil. Living in a house with 4 women is enough to send any man clean off his chump. Between them all, they'll send me into a lunatic asylum." It was certainly an uncomfortable atmosphere. Caroline, as I said, was obviously cutting up rough about the whole thing. In a polite, well-bred way, she was ruder to Elsa than one would believe possible, without a single actually offensive word. Elsa herself was openly and flagrantly rude to Caroline. She was top dog, and she knew it, and no scruples of good breeding restrained her from overt bad manners. The result was that Crail spent most of his time scrapping with the girl Angela when he wasn't painting. They were usually on affectionate terms, though they teased and fought a good deal, but on this occasion there was an edge in everything Amias said or did, and the two of them really lost their tempers with each other. And the 4th member of the party was the governess, a sour-faced hag, Amias called her. She hates me like poison, sits there with her lips set together, disapproving of me without stopping. It was then that he said, "God damn all women. If a man is to have any peace, he must steer clear of women." "You oughtn't to have married," I said. "You're the sort of man who ought to keep clear of domestic ties." He replied that it was too late to talk about that now. He added that no doubt Caroline would be only too glad to get rid of him. That was the first indication I had that something unusual was in the wind. I said, "What's all this? Is this business with the lovely Elsa serious, then?" He said with a sort of groan, "She is lovely, isn't she? Sometimes I wish I'd never seen her." I said, "Look here, old boy, you must take a hold on yourself. You don't want to get tied up with any more women." He looked at me and laughed. He said, "It's all very well for you to talk. I can't let women alone. Simply can't do it. And if I could, they wouldn't let me alone." Then he shrugged those great shoulders of his, grinned at me and said, "Oh, well, it will all pan out in the end, I expect. And you must admit the picture is good." He was referring to the portrait he was doing of Elsa, and although I had very little technical knowledge of painting, even I could see that it was going to be a work of especial power. Whilst he was painting, Amias was a different man. Although he would growl, groan, frown, swear extravagantly, and sometimes hurl his brushes away, he was really intensely happy. It was only when he came back to the house for meals that the hostile atmosphere between the women got him down. That hostility came to a head on September the 17th. We had had an embarrassing lunch. Elsa had been particularly, really, I think insolent is the only word for it. She had ignored Caroline pointedly, persistently addressing the conversation to Amias, as though he and she were alone in the room. Caroline had talked lightly and gaily to the rest of us, cleverly contriving so that several perfectly innocent-sounding remarks should have a sting. She hadn't got Elsa Greer's scornful honesty. With Caroline, everything was oblique, suggested rather than said. Things came to a head after lunch in the drawing-room, just as we were finishing coffee. I had commented on a carved head in highly polished beechwood, a very curious thing, and Caroline said, "That is the work of a young Norwegian sculptor. Amias and I admire his work very much. We hope to go and see him next summer." That calm assumption of possession was too much for Elsa. She was never one to let a challenge pass. She waited a minute or two, and then she spoke in her clear, rather overemphasized voice. She said, "This would be a lovely room if it was properly fixed. It's got far too much furniture in it. When I'm living here, I shall take all the rubbish out and just leave 1 or 2 good pieces, and I shall have copper-coloured curtains, I think, so that the setting sun will just catch them through that big western window." She turned to me and said, "Don't you think that would be rather lovely?" I didn't have time to answer. Caroline spoke. and her voice was soft and silky, and what I can only describe as dangerous. She said, "Are you thinking of buying this place, Elsa?" Elsa said, "It won't be necessary for me to buy it." Caroline said, "What do you mean?" And there was no softness in her voice now. It was hard and metallic. Elsa laughed. She said, "Must we pretend?" "Come now, Caroline. You know very well what I mean." Caroline said, "I've no idea." Elsa said to that, "Don't be such an ostrich. It's no good pretending you don't see and know all about it. Amias and I care for each other. This isn't your home, it's his. And after we're married, I shall live here with him." Caroline said, "I think you're crazy." Elsa said, "Oh no, I'm not, my dear, and you know it. It would be much simpler if we were honest with each other. Amias and I love each other. You've seen that clearly enough. There's only one decent thing for you to do. You've got to give him his freedom." Caroline said, "I don't believe a word of what you're saying." But her voice was unconvincing. Elsa had got under her guard all right. And at that minute, Amias Crail came into the room, and Elsa said with a laugh, "If you don't believe me, ask him." And Caroline said, "I will." She didn't pause at all. She said, "Amias, Elsa says you want to marry her. Is this true?" Poor Amias. I felt sorry for him. It makes a man feel a fool to have a scene of that kind forced upon him. He went crimson and started blustering. He turned on Elsa and asked her why the devil she couldn't have held her tongue. Caroline said, "Then it is true." He didn't say anything, just stood there passing his finger round inside the neck of his shirt. He used to do that as a kid when he got into a jam of any kind. He said, and he tried to make the words sound dignified and authoritative, and of course couldn't manage it, poor devil, "I don't want to discuss it." Caroline said, "But we're going to discuss it." Elsa chipped in and said, "I think it's only fair to Caroline that she should be told." Caroline said very quietly, "Is it true, Amias?" He looked a bit ashamed of himself. Men do when women pin them down in a corner. She said, "Answer me, please. I've got to know." He flung up his head then, rather the way a bull does in the bull ring. He snapped out, "It's true enough, but I don't want to discuss it now." And he turned and strode out of the room. I went after him. I didn't want to be left with the women. I caught up with him on the terrace. He was swearing. I've never known a man swear more heartily. Then he raved, "Why couldn't she hold her tongue? Why the devil couldn't she hold her tongue? Now the fat's in the fire and I've got to finish that picture, do you hear, Phil? It's the best thing I've done. The best thing I've ever done in my life. And a couple of damn fool women want to muck it up between them." Then he calmed down a little and said women had no sense of proportion. I couldn't help smiling a little. I said, "Well, dash it all, old boy. You have brought this on yourself. Don't I know it," he said, and groaned. Then he added, "But you must admit, Phil, that a man couldn't be blamed for losing his head about her. Even Caroline ought to understand that." I asked him what would happen if Caroline got her back up and refused to give him a divorce, but by now he had gone off into a fit of abstraction. I repeated the remark, and he said absently, "Oh, Caroline would never be vindictive. You don't understand, old boy." "Well, there's the child," I pointed out. He took me by the arm. "Phil, old boy, you mean well, but don't go on croaking like a raven. I can manage my affairs. Everything will turn out all right. You'll see if it doesn't." That was Amias all over, an absolutely unjustified optimist. He said now, cheerfully, "To hell with the whole pack of them." I don't know whether we would have said anything more, but a few minutes later Caroline swept out on the terrace. She'd got a hat on, a queer, flopping, dark brown hat, rather attractive. She said in an absolutely ordinary, everyday voice, "Take off that paint-stained coat, Amias. We're going over to Meredith's to tea. Don't you remember?" He stared, stammered a bit as he said, "Oh, I'd forgotten. Yes, of course we are." She said, "Then go and try and make yourself look less like a rag-and-bone man." Although her voice was quite natural, she didn't look at him. She moved over towards a bed of dahlias and began picking off some of the overblown flowers. Amias turned round slowly and went into the house. Caroline talked to me. She talked a good deal about the chances of the weather lasting and whether there might be mackerel about, and if so, Amias and Angela and I might like to go fishing. She was really amazing. I've got to hand it to her. But I think myself that showed the sort of woman she was. She had enormous strength of will and complete command over herself. I don't know whether she'd made up her mind to kill him then, but I shouldn't be surprised. and she was capable of making her plans carefully and unemotionally, with an absolutely clear and ruthless mind. Caroline Crail was a very dangerous woman. I ought to have realized that then, that she wasn't prepared to take this thing lying down. But like a fool, I thought that she had made up her mind to accept the inevitable. Or else, possibly, she thought that if she carried on exactly as usual, Amias might change his mind. Presently the others came out, Elsa looking defiant, at the same time triumphant. Caroline took no notice of her. Angela really saved the situation. She came out arguing with Miss Williams that she wasn't going to change her skirt for anyone. It was quite all right, good enough for darling old Meredith anyway. He never noticed anything. We got off at last. Caroline walked with Angela, and I walked with Amias, and Elsa walked by herself, smiling. I didn't admire her myself, too violent a type, but I have to admit that she looked incredibly beautiful that afternoon. Women do when they've got what they want. I can't remember the events of that afternoon clearly at all. It's all blurred. I remember old Mary coming out to meet us. I think we walked round the garden first. I remember having a long discussion with Angela about the training of terriers for ratting. She ate an incredible lot of apples and tried to persuade me to do so too. When we got back to the house, tea was going on under the big cedar tree. Mary, I remember, was looking very upset. I suppose either Caroline or Amias had told him something. He was looking doubtfully at Caroline, and then he stared at Elsa. The old boy looked thoroughly worried. Of course, Caroline liked to have Meredith on a string, more or less, the devoted, platonic friend who would never, never go too far. She was that kind of woman. After tea, Meredith had a hurried word with me. He said, "Look here, Phil, Amias can't do this thing." I said, "Make no mistake, he's going to do it. He can't leave his wife and child and go off with this girl. He's years older than she is. She can't be more than 18. I said to him that Miss Greer was a fully sophisticated 20. He said, "Well, anyway, that's underage. She can't know what she's doing." Poor old Meredith. Always the chivalrous Pakasab. I said, "Don't worry, old boy. She knows what she's doing. And she likes it." That's all we had the chance of saying. I thought to myself that probably Mary felt disturbed at the thought of Caroline being a deserted wife. Once the divorce was through, she might expect her faithful Dobbin to marry her. I had an idea that hopeless devotion was really far more in his line. I must confess that that side of it amused me. Curiously enough, I remember very little about our visit to Meredith's stink room. He enjoyed showing people his hobby. Personally, I always found it very boring. I suppose I was in there with the rest of them when he gave a dissertation on the efficacy of conaine, but I don't remember it. And I didn't see Caroline pinch the stuff. As I've said, she was a very adroit woman. I do remember Meredith reading aloud the passage from Plato describing Socrates' death. Very boring, I thought. Classics always did bore me. There's nothing much more I can remember now about that day. Amias and Angela had a first-class row, I know, and the rest of us rather welcomed it. It avoided other difficulties. Angela rushed off to bed with a final vituperative outburst. She said, A, she'd pay him out. B, she wished he were dead. C, she hoped he'd die of leprosy. It would serve him right. D, she wished a sausage would stick to his nose like in the fairy story and never come off. When she'd gone, we all laughed. We couldn't help it. It was such a funny mixture. Caroline went up to bed immediately afterwards. Miss Williams disappeared after her pupil. Amias and Elsa went off together into the garden. It was clear that I wasn't wanted. I went for a stroll by myself. It was a lovely night. I came down late the following morning. There was no one in the dining room. Funny the things you do remember. I remember the taste of the kidneys and bacon I ate quite well. They were very good kidneys. Devilled. Afterwards, I wandered out looking for everybody. I went outside, didn't see anybody, smoked a cigarette, encountered Miss Williams running about looking for Angela, who had played truant as usual when she ought to have been mending a torn frock. I went back into the hall and realized that Amias and Caroline were having a set-to in the library. They were talking very loud. I heard her say, "You and your women, I'd like to kill you. Someday I will kill you." Amias said, "Don't be a fool, Caroline." And she said, "I mean it, Amias." Well, I didn't want to overhear any more. I went out again. I wandered along the terrace the other way. and came across Elsa. She was sitting on one of the long seats. The seat was directly under the library window, and the window was open. I should imagine that there wasn't much she had missed of what was going on inside. When she saw me, she got up as cool as a cucumber and came towards me. She was smiling. She took my arm and said, "Isn't it a lovely morning?" It was a lovely morning for her, all right. Rather a cruel girl. No, I think merely honest, and lacking in imagination. What she wanted herself was the only thing that she could see. We'd been standing on the terrace talking for about 5 minutes, when I heard the library door bang and Amias Crail come out. He was very red in the face. He caught hold of Elsa unceremoniously by the shoulder. He said, "Come on, time for you to sit. I want to get on with that picture." She said, "All right, I'll just go and get a pullover. There's a chilly wind." She went into the house. I wondered if Amias would say anything to me, but he didn't say much, just, "These women." I said, "Cheer up, old boy." Then we neither of us said anything till Elsa came out of the house again. They went off together down to the Battery Garden. I went into the house. Caroline was standing in the hall. I don't think she even noticed me. It was a way of hers at times. She'd seem to go right away, to get inside herself, as it were. She just murmured something, and not to me, to herself. I just caught the words, "It's too cruel." That's what she said. Then she walked past me and upstairs, still without seeming to see me, just like a person intent on some inner vision. I think myself, I've no authority for saying this, you understand, that she went up to get the stuff, and that it was then she decided to do what she did do. And just at that moment the telephone rang. In some houses one would wait for the servants to answer it, but I was so often at Alderbury that I acted more or less as one of the family. I picked up the receiver. It was my brother Meredith's voice that answered. He was very upset. He explained that he had been into his laboratory and that the quinine bottle was half empty. I don't need to go over all the things I know I ought to have done. The thing was so startling, and I was foolish enough to be taken aback. Meredith was dithering a good bit at the other end. I heard someone on the stairs, and I just told him sharply to come over at once. I myself went down to meet him. In case you don't know the lay of the land, the shortest way from one estate to the other was by rowing across a small creek. I went down the path to where the boats were kept by a small jetty. To do so, I passed under the wall of the Battery Garden. I could hear Elsa and Amias talking as he painted. They sounded very cheerful and carefree. Amias said it was an amazingly hot day. So it was, very hot for September. And Elsa said that sitting where she was, poised on the battlements, there was a cold wind blowing in from the sea. Then she said, "I'm horribly stiff from posing. Can't I have a rest, darling?" And I heard Amias cry out, "Not on your life. Stick it. You're a tough girl. And this is going good, I tell you." I heard Elsa say, "Brute," and laugh as I went out of earshot. Meredith was just rowing himself across from the other side. I waited for him. He tied up the boat and came up the steps. He was looking very white and worried. He said to me, "Your head's better than mine, Philip. What ought I to do? That stuff's dangerous." I said, "Are you absolutely sure about this?" Meredith, you see, was always a rather vague kind of chap. Perhaps that's why I didn't take it as seriously as I ought to have done. And he said he was quite sure. The bottle had been full yesterday afternoon. I said, "And you've absolutely no idea who pinched it?" He said none whatever, and asked me what I thought. Could it have been one of the servants? I said I suppose it might have been, but it seemed unlikely to me. He always kept the door locked, didn't he? Always, he said, and then began a rigmarole about having found a window a few inches open at the bottom. Someone might have got in that way. "A chance burglar?" I asked sceptically. "It seems to me, Meredith, that there are some very nasty possibilities." He said, what did I really think? And I said, if he was sure he wasn't making a mistake, that probably Caroline had taken it to poison Elsa with, or that, alternatively, Elsa had taken it to get Caroline out of the way and straighten the path of true love. Meredith twittered a bit. He said it was absurd and melodramatic and couldn't be true. I said, well, the stuff's gone. What's your explanation? He hadn't any, of course. Actually thought just as I did, but didn't want to face the fact. He said again, what are we to do? I said, damn fool that I was, we must think it over carefully. Either you'd better announce your loss straight out when everybody's there, Or else you'd better get Caroline alone and tax her with it. If you're convinced she's nothing to do with it, adopt the same tactics for Elsa." He said, "A girl like that? She couldn't have taken it." I said I wouldn't put it past her. We were walking up to the house as we talked. After that last remark of mine, neither of us spoke for some few seconds. We were rounding the Battery garden again, and I heard Caroline's voice. I thought perhaps a three-handed row was going on, but actually it was Angela that they were discussing. Caroline was protesting. She said, "It's very hard on the girl," and Amias made some impatient rejoinder. Then the door to the garden opened, just as we came abreast of it. Amias looked a little taken aback at seeing us. Caroline was just coming out. She said, "Hello, Meredith. We've been discussing the question of Angela's going to school. I'm not at all sure it's the right thing for her." Amias said, "Don't fuss about the girl. She'll be all right. Good riddance." Just then Elsa came running down the path from the house. She had some sort of scarlet jumper in her hand. Amias growled, "Come along. Get back into the pose. I don't want to waste time." He went back to where his easel was standing. I noticed that he staggered a bit, and I wondered if he'd been drinking. A man might easily be excused for doing so with all the fuss and the scenes. He grumbled, "The beer here is red hot. Why can't we keep some ice down here?" And Caroline Crail said, "I'll send you down some beer just off the ice." Amias grunted out, "Thanks." Then Caroline shut the door of the Battery garden and came up with us to the house. We sat down on the terrace and she went into the house. About 5 minutes later, Angela came along with a couple of bottles of beer and some glasses. It was a hot day, and we were glad to see it. As we were drinking it, Caroline passed us. She was carrying another bottle and said she would take it down to Amias. Meredith said he'd go, but she was quite firm that she'd go herself. I thought, fool that I was, that it was just her jealousy. She couldn't stand those two being alone down there. That was what had taken her down there once already, with the weak pretext of arguing about Angela's departure. She went off down that zigzag path, and Meredith and I watched her go. We'd still not decided anything, and now Angela clamoured that I should come bathing with her. It seemed impossible to get Meredith alone. I just said to him, "After lunch," and he nodded. Then I went off bathing with Angela. We had a good swim, across the creek and back, and then we lay out on the rocks sunbathing. Angela was a bit taciturn, and that suited me. I made up my mind that directly after lunch I'd take Caroline aside and accuse her point-blank of having stolen the stuff. No use letting Meredith do it. He'd be too weak. No, I'd tax her with it outright. After that, she'd have to give it back, or even if she didn't, she wouldn't dare use it. I was pretty sure it must be her on thinking things over. Elsa was far too sensible and hard-boiled a young woman to risk tampering with poisons. She had a hard head and would take care of her own skin. Caroline was made of more dangerous stuff, unbalanced, carried away by impulses, and definitely neurotic. And still, you know, at the back of my mind was the feeling that Meredith might have made a mistake. Or some servant might have been poking about in there and spilt the stuff and then not dared to own up. You see, poison seems such a melodramatic thing. You can't believe in it. Not till it happens. It was quite late when I looked at my watch, and Angela and I fairly raced up to lunch. They were just sitting down, all but Amias, who had remained down in the Battery painting. Quite a normal thing for him to do, and privately, I thought him very wise to elect to do it today. Lunch was likely to have been an awkward meal. We had coffee on the terrace. I wish I could remember better how Caroline looked and acted. She didn't seem excited in any way. Quiet and rather sad is my impression. What a devil that woman was. For it is a devilish thing to do, to poison a man in cold blood. If there had been a revolver about and she'd caught it up and shot him, well, that might have been understandable, but this cold, deliberate, vindictive poisoning, and so calm and collected. She got up and said she'd take his coffee to him in the most natural way possible, and yet she knew, she must have known, that by now she'd find him dead. Miss Williams went with her. I don't remember if that was at Caroline's suggestion or not. I rather think it was. The two women went off together. Meredith strolled away shortly afterwards. I was just making an excuse to go after him when he came running up the path again. His face was grey. He gasped out, We must get a doctor, quick. Amias. I sprang up. Is he ill? Dying? Meredith said, I'm afraid he's dead. We'd forgotten Elsa for the minute, but she let out a sudden cry. It was like the wail of a banshee. She cried, Dead? Dead? And then she ran. I didn't know anyone could move like that, like a deer, like a stricken thing, and like an avenging fury, too. Meredith panted out, Go after her. I'll telephone. Go after her. You don't know what she'll do. I did go after her, and it's as well I did. She might quite easily have killed Caroline. I've never seen such grief and such frenzied hate. All the veneer of refinement and education was stripped off. You could see her father and her father's mother, and her father had been mill hands. Deprived of her lover, she was just elemental woman. She'd have clawed Caroline's face, torn her hair, hurled her over the parapet if she could. She thought for some reason or other that Caroline had knifed him. She'd got it all wrong, naturally. I held her off. Then Miss Williams took charge. She was good, I must say. She got Elsa to control herself in under a minute, told her she'd got to be quiet, and that we couldn't have this noise and violence going on. She was a Tartar, that woman, but she did the trick. Elsa was quiet, just stood there gasping and trembling. As for Caroline, as far as I'm concerned, the mask was right off. She stood there perfectly quiet. You might have said dazed, but she wasn't dazed. It was her eyes gave her away. They were watchful, fully aware and quietly watchful. She'd begun, I suppose, to be afraid. I went up to her and spoke to her. I said it quite low. I don't think either of the two women overheard. I said, You damned murderess. You've killed my best friend. She shrank back. She said, No. Oh, no. He did it himself. I looked her full in the eyes. I said, You can tell that story to the police. She did. And they didn't believe her. End of Philip Blake's statement.
End of Disc 4.